Ladies and gentlemen, your first storyteller of the evening, Larry Castleberry.
May 8th of 1999, there are 5 messages on my answering machine at work. The first 3 are from my wife, and they're telling me, Larry, doctors are saying that the baby is under duress, and they're going to need to do an emergency C-section. The other 2 messages are from the nurse, who are saying, Mr. Castleberry, get your butt down to the hospital now. Now see, what I heard was, I was about to become a daddy. Me, a father. And I stood up to share this joy with those in my office, but there was nobody there. So I leave the office and run and get into my car and make a beeline to the hospital. When I get into the operating room, there are 2 things that I noticed right away. First, my wife's stomach, which was so big that morning, was completely flat. The second thing I noticed was I didn't hear a sound coming from our newborn. I saw a lot of doctors and nurses around me, but I didn't hear anything. Babies are supposed to cry when they come into this world. So I walked over to my wife. She has a smile on her face, and I squeeze her hand. She says, I think it's a boy. How's he doing? I look at her and say, I'm not sure, baby, but let me go find out. And I head over to my newborn son and this group of doctors and nurses. One of the nurses see me coming, and she pulls away from the group and intercepts me. And I remember she pulls down her blue mask and she says, Mr. Castleberry, there were some complications, but the doctors are doing all that they can. So I looked at her and I said, he's going to be okay, right? She looks at me and she says, I didn't say that. What I said is, the doctors are doing all that they can. Now, I'm not sure how you're supposed to respond when someone tells you that your newborn is not doing okay. I go back to my wife and I squeeze her hand. I said, baby, doctors are doing what they can. He'll be okay. A little bit later, Dr. Ham comes and talks to me. And he says, Mr. Castleberry, I want to be honest with you. Looks like your son went a long period without oxygen. We're not sure. We're doing some tests. But the only reason that we know that your son is alive is because he has a strong heartbeat. He's not breathing on his own. No other bodily functions seem to be working. And I'm very concerned about the kidneys, because if they're not working, that's just going to exasperate the problem. Go back to my wife and hold her hands, and by this time, families begin to come in. And one of the first ones to get there is my mother-in-law, as I like to call my mother-in-law. And I pull her aside and I tell her what the doctor said. And she makes a beeline to go back and see her brand new grandson. A little later, she comes back into the room, and her eyes are just beet red from crying. She says, Larry, you can't tell her. It'll break her heart. You just can't tell her. A little bit later, my mother comes. And I pull my mama aside and I tell her what the doctor says. And she makes a beeline back there to go see her first grandbaby. And while I'm sitting in the room with my wife and squeezing her hand and telling her everything's going to be okay, Mama comes back into the room. And she says, boy, I just talked to Aunt Cassie. That baby going to be all right. That baby doesn't have brain damage. If God wanted that baby to be here, that baby's going to be here. I can feel the eyes of my wife looking at me because I haven't told her this. I squeeze her hand. I said, baby, he's going to be okay. A little bit later, Dr. Ham comes to me again to give me an update. He tells me that the blood work has come back and it is extremely acidic, which means that Marcellus, our son, has gone a long period without oxygen. And more than likely, there's going to be brain damage, severe brain damage. Then he tells me that he urinated on one of the nurses. So I looked at the doctor and I said, well, we know his kidneys are working now, don't we? A little bit later, I make a call to my dad, and my stepmother answers the phone, and I just tell her that I'm a daddy. She can tell something was not quite right by my voice. A little bit later on that evening, my dad gives a call. Now, my dad is an ex-military man, strong man, loving, strict. And my mother always knew how to get me to do whatever she needed me to do by saying, you know, your daddy was real good at that. My dad is also the ultimate optimist. So when he calls and I answer that phone, he says, hey boy, I see you got a new bundle of joy. Then I tell my dad what the doctor says. My father says, oh, huh, darn, man. Well, son, doctors don't know everything. I mean, they said there were complications when I was born. But I tell you what you're going to do. You're going to pray, and I'm going to pray. And I'm coming up there. We'll be up there, but you keep me abreast of what's going on. Hang up that phone. Later that night, while I'm sleeping, I can hear my wife break down and cry, crying for our son Marcellus. And I get up and I hug her and I say, baby, everything's going to be okay. Because you see, men are supposed to be strong. We aren't allowed to cry. But while I'm hugging her and telling her that everything's going to be okay, I'm praying. See, I'm the type of person that have always prayed for miracles. As a child, I would pray that the teacher wouldn't call my house to tell my mother how I showed up in school. As a teenager, I would pray to God to let me pass that test that I didn't study for. And when I was in my 20s, I prayed that somebody would discover me and learn how to make me a multimillionaire by using my voice. But that night, I prayed to God to not take my son from me. I said, God, please, please don't take him. The next morning, Sunday, May 9th, I got up and I ran down to the neonatal intensive care unit. Wanted to see if my boy had survived the night. And the nurse was there, and I saw him in his incubator, and he's just laying there with all these tubes and wires coming out of him. And I happened to pick up one of the many children books they had there in the ward. And I started to read. And while I'm reading, he opens up one eye, looks around the room, see who's making all that noise. And I look at him and I say, yes, son, it's Daddy. Daddy's here. I read quite a few books to him that day. While I was reading one book, I don't remember what the book was, suddenly both of his eyes opened up and they rolled to the back of his head. And his body started to convulse. And the nurse came over, and I'm just in a state of panic. What's going on? What's happening? What's happening? And while she's opening up the incubator and trying to calm him down, she speaks to me and said, he's having a seizure. The next morning, Monday, May 10th, I again wake up early and make a beeline down to that neonatal intensive care unit. And I walk in, and there's the same nurse from the night before. She has a smile on her face. I said, how's he doing? She said, he's doing well. Just then, Dr. Hand walks in, and he has this confused look on his face. And he comes up to me, and he says, Mr. Castleberry, I don't understand it. I can't explain it. It's a miracle. Your son is breathing on his own. He had no seizures last night. He's doing well. And he saw that smile start to widen my face. He didn't want to give me too much hope. So he said, but the brain. I don't know about the condition of the brain. And I smiled and I shook that doctor's hand. Thank you, doctor. And that was another 11 days before Marcellus was able to come home. And in that time, my wife and I got to meet, get to know some of the other parents there. There was a young lady there whose son had been in that ward since February. And she would come down there every single day to spend time with her baby. And then there was the couple from the UP whose son was 9 pounds at birth. I'd never in my life seen a baby so big. I mean, he looked like he can go out there and just play football right then and there. The problem was, because he was so big, there were complications during his birth. And the rural hospital was not equipped to handle it. So they had to airlift him to Henry Ford. And I was there the day that the nurse asked for the chaplain. And I can still remember hearing the anguished cries of those parents when they found out that their son had died. And I realized that that father would never be able to play catch with his son. Would never hear his son say, "Daddy, Daddy." He would never be able to talk to his son about the birds and bees or give his son the sage advice that we fathers dream of giving our sons one day. And it reminded me just how lucky and fortunate I was. Now, this past May 8th, we celebrated Marcellus' 16th birthday. He does have a mild case of cerebral palsy, legally blind in one eye, hearing loss in both ears, but he's here. And each and every day, he wakes up and gives us one of those big old smiles. It's another opportunity, another chance to create one of those sentimental moments that we'll cherish forever. As a child, I always prayed for a miracle. But on May 8th, 1999, God gave me the greatest miracle of all. Thank you.
Larry Castleberry. So glad your son is here, Marcellus.